Namaste, Satbir Ji Singh. Thank you so much for your time. Namaste, Satbir Ji Singh. Thank you so much for your time. I hope I've got the introduction right in terms of your name.
Yes.
Great.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much once again for your time and this space. Without much ado, we will get started by asking you, what are non-communicable diseases?
So these are diseases which are not infectious diseases, hence the term non-communicable, because they cannot be transmitted between individuals. So they largely represent diseases that are based upon lifestyle behaviors. So the major risk factors for these diseases are low levels of physical activity, poor dietary choices, and then dysfunctional health behaviors like excessive alcohol consumption or cigarette smoking. And then we could add to that list chronic stress. So those are the risk factors. And some of the typical non-communicable diseases are obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, depression, anxiety, and even cancer. 50% of cancer is preventable. That's one of the characteristics of non-communicable diseases, is that they are lifestyle-based diseases, and therefore, given that they're from lifestyle behaviors, they are essentially preventable diseases.
Okay, and how prevalent are they in today's society?
They are extremely prevalent, and they represent the vast majority of deaths and the vast majority of disease in modern medicine. As a consequence, they absorb a vast majority of the costs of healthcare. And in the United States, that's basically 90% of healthcare costs and 90% of diseases, of deaths due to disease. In India, it's a little less because there are more communicable diseases, but even there, it's still a vast majority of the cost and the morbidity, the death rate.
Okay, so as we are talking about yoga, and yoga practice today is quite vast with many styles. It seems like there is a yoga practice to suit every individual and the varied mental and emotional needs. Would it be fair to say that, first, yoga as a philosophy and yoga practice are better used separately? Yoga as a theory, philosophy, rules of living, and or yoga practice, the application of yoga in its 8 forms, and also adding to that a new variety called sport yoga? Or would it be appropriate to have less of classifications? Or should we leave it with one term, yoga, and let individuals, so as not to box them, compartmentalize and limit its meaning? Should we just throw it open to that?
Yeah, I think the word yoga is open to a lot of variation. And I think, of course, historical traditional yoga is this multi-component practice. It was actually practiced as a lifestyle. The major components that you see in modern society with traditional yoga practice are the asanas, or the physical postures and exercises, the breathing techniques, or the pranayama, the deep relaxation, and very importantly, the meditative component. That is how traditional historic yoga was practiced, and that's how it is practiced in modern society. However, it is possible for individuals to practice what we call a yoga lifestyle, in which there are additional elements that are on top of those basic practices. So things like the philosophy, the yamas and the niyamas, disciplines and the restrictions on behavior. There's dietary recommendations, there's living in a community, etc. So these are additional practices that people can expand into as a yoga lifestyle. But even the traditional yoga with those four basic components, many people and many organizations have restricted themselves to, say, maybe just even one of those elements. So there are many yoga practices which are nothing but asanas, nothing but physical postures and exercises. So this might be what you refer to as sport yoga. And many people view these asanas as just an alternative form of physical exercise. So in these types of practices, people will come in, they'll sweat, they'll do the practices, they'll walk out the door at the end, and that's it. There's no meditation, there's no pranayama, and they call that yoga. Well, it is yoga because they're doing asanas, and they're doing the physical postures that are, typical of yoga, the yoga tradition. However, technically that's a limited form of yoga. So if we want to use terms, I would sort of use two terms. One is yoga, one is a yoga lifestyle, and one is limited yoga. And they are all sort of elements of yoga. So I would not sort of take the word yoga out of it, but you can sort of modify it. You can say it's traditional, multi-component yoga, or you can say it's a yoga lifestyle, which is very complete, or you can say it's limited yoga. They've chosen just one element and they're practicing that.
Thank you for that. So when we speak about research in yoga, is it based on a certain style of yoga practice which is the most popular, or on what basis are we looking at the research in connection to especially what we just shared, that sometimes just one component of yoga is followed, and that might not give you an accurate result-oriented practice. So how do we look at, I guess, understanding what yoga research is and what it inculcates? So what does yoga research include?
So the content of what is researched in yoga research is not determined by any organization or governmental body or society. There's no one dictating what should be studied. The research that is done in yoga is done by yoga researchers, by investigators, by scientists. And these scientists choose what they wish to study. That includes what kind of yoga they study. That includes how much of it, which component of it. They choose whether they want to modify it or to restrict it. And they also choose what topic of research they're studying. They could be studying the effects on physiology or psychology in normal, healthy individuals, or they could be studying yoga as a therapeutic intervention. They could be studying yoga for diabetes or yoga for cardiovascular disease. This is all determined by the yoga researcher. Now, people who come into yoga research and become yoga researchers have come to this field not because it's something strange or odd or someone has given them money to do this. they have come into this field because they have themselves practiced yoga and are convinced of its potential benefits and want to evaluate the benefits in both healthy individuals and in disease states. And typically, most people who have come into this field as yoga researchers are very familiar with yoga as the traditional practice. So most of the research that's been done is the yoga that incorporates the asanas, the pranayama, the deep relaxation, and the meditative component. Now, having understood that, they may need to modify that. So, for example, if they are studying patients with low back pain, or they are studying patients with cancer, they may not be able to do the full range of yoga practices because these are vulnerable populations with limited ability, limited physical capacities. So they may have to modify these practices. And so we end up with modifications, things such as chair yoga, in which a chair is used to assist the individuals. And then it's a subset of the range of practices. So you won't see advanced pranayama practices. You would see very simple, long, slow, deep breathing. You won't see, headstands. You will see spinal flexes instead, and simple loosening exercises. So it really varies depending upon the population that's being studied. But most yoga researchers are very familiar with the whole concept and the meaning of traditional holistic yoga.
In that context, obviously people are still getting results by doing even a chair yoga or deep, long breathing. So that in itself, I guess, would guide us to understand the benefits of a complete traditional yoga class. Would I be accurate in saying that?
Yes, absolutely. You could take any one of those components and practice them, and you will get benefits.
Wow.
Particularly strong are the effects of pranayama, slow breathing, in particular, and meditation. Of course, meditation alone has become its own industry, if you will. It's become extremely popular. You now have many different styles of meditation that people practice: transcendental meditation, mindfulness meditation, the Buddhistic form of meditation, which has become extremely popular internationally. And there are a lot of benefits of meditation practice alone, and there's an enormous amount of research in the field of meditation studies. So yes, you can take one component of yoga and practice it and get benefit.
What are the benefits of yoga practice in non-communicable diseases?
So because non-communicable diseases are really coming from, lifestyle behavior, inappropriate lifestyle behavior, not getting enough physical exercise, having a poor dietary choices, or eating junk food and foods that are not healthful, and then this aberrant healthy behaviors like cigarette smoking and excessive alcohol consumption. The drives for these lifestyles are based upon several factors. Why do people adopt these kinds of behaviors? Well, one factor is chronic stress. So that is something that has come to epidemic proportions internationally. People are not coping with stress in modern society and life adequately. And chronic stress can drive aberrant behaviors. People will try to cope with their stress by alcohol. And then, of course, that's not a functional solution. So stress is a major player, and it has a very positive impact on disease states in terms of making those disease states worse. So even in disorders such as heart disease or hypertension or obesity or type 2 diabetes, stress is playing a big role in making the symptoms of that disease worse. In fact, in some cases, chronic stress is the major driver and the major reason for that disease to come into play. And one of the diseases in which stress is a major risk factor is major depression. So yoga is very well known at being a very good stress management strategy. It's very good at yielding stress improvement. Another facet that yoga is very good at is improving mind-body awareness, improving the sensitivity of one's experience of one's body and mind. This is also, of course, now called mindfulness. And people who are not mindful will not be sensitive to how their body or mind reacts to certain circumstances. So one of the big dietary issues is junk food, eating food that's highly processed or high levels of refined sugar. These have a very strong negative impact on the body and ultimately lead to these risk factors for obesity and type 2 diabetes and hypertension. And so one of the reasons people can eat these kinds of foods in the quantities that they eat them is that they're not sensitive to their body's response to these negative foods, these negative diets. And so as you practice yoga, you become more sensitive to your body. And then you start to experience the consequences of eating this kind of food. And when you do that, you notice that your body reacts negatively to these types of foods. In fact, that negative experience is experienced as a negative feeling. It doesn't feel good to eat that food. So as a consequence, you stop eating it. And you start eating foods that feel good. So vegetables, grains, whole foods. You start eating those foods and you notice that you feel better when you eat those foods. So this is the drive that mindfulness and mind-body awareness that's driven by particularly the meditative component of yoga can actually change behavior from the bottom up. And the reason I say from the bottom up is that this is driven, this lifestyle, positive lifestyle change is driven by an increase in mindfulness or mind-body awareness. Whereas in modern medicine, when the doctor says to the patient, you have hypertension, you have type 2 diabetes, you must change your diet. You must stop, eating too much refined foods, too much carbohydrates, too much refined sugar. You need to eat whole foods. And you need to reduce the quantity of food that you're eating. The patient goes home and tries to accomplish this, but, these are instructions from the top down. And the patient has no resources to succeed in that change in diet, which is a major transition and a major lifestyle change. But the beauty of yoga practice is that you're making this change from the bottom up. The patient wants to make these changes because he or she is receiving the rewards of the positive lifestyle behaviors and the negative experience of the negative lifestyle behaviors.
Wow, that's just fantastic. And I would second that. I've seen those changes happening in my life, but there's a funny part to this. The first time these changes started happening, I actually started questioning whether I'm quite okay or not because my appetite reduced. And it's interesting you say what you said, because yes, that's exactly what happened in my case. But I was lucky enough to have access to a good yoga teacher and a good Ayurvedic doctor, and they shared with me what you just shared, which is your body will start talking to you. So thank you for that. And could it be possible for us to tangibly share why yoga practice does this? What's so special about it?
Well, when you consider the act of meditation, this is where it comes from. So what is meditation? Meditation is the relaxed, non-analytical focus of attention. And when you focus your attention in meditation, you come to a state where mind wandering, which is the sort of the default situation, when you're not focusing your attention, mind wandering ceases. Now, the content of mind wandering is generally driven by our needs, by our life. And the major content in mind wandering is survival issues. Now, mind wandering, which we all experience, this chain of thoughts that we are all constantly going through, the major content of mind wandering is really survival related. And survival issues are inherently uncertain. You don't know if you're going to have the money to pay your rent. You don't know if you have the money to send your child to school. You don't know if you're going to have the the money to provide for your family. So when you have constant thoughts about survival issues, am I going to make it to work on time? Will I succeed in my job? These generate a stress response. And as you constantly mind wander about these stressful thoughts, you become more stressed. So this is the basis of chronic stress. Now, the pandemic, of course, has been a major player. Will I get this disorder? Will my relatives be healthy? When you're constantly thinking about these kinds of thoughts, you are generating more and more stress. And this turns from acute stress into chronic stress. And chronic stress then starts to have these negative impacts on the body that produce the risk factors for these behaviors and for chronic diseases themselves. So what happens when you meditate? So depending upon the style of meditation, and in yoga mostly we do the style of meditation we refer to as single point focus or concentrative meditation. You are focusing on a word, on a mantra, or on a candle, or on the breath. That's a very common form of meditation. So you start to focus your attention, you engage the attention networks of the brain, and what happens, of course, is the attention networks can only do one thing at a time. So you are either mind wandering or focusing attention. So mind wandering ceases. So for at least the amount of time that you're successfully holding your attention, it's kind of like a holiday from all of this negative stress thinking. So that's one aspect. But the more important aspect is that what happens during meditation is that there's a cycle. You slip into mind wandering inadvertently as you're trying to focus your attention. You start thinking about something and then you notice, oh, I'm supposed to be focusing on my breath. And then you bring your mind back to the focus point and you keep your focus, and then suddenly you lose it again. You think about something else, what you're going to eat, what you did yesterday, and then you remember and then you bring it back. So meditation is this cycle that goes around and around and around. And you are practicing the technique of bringing your attention back to the focus point. Now, as this happens for hours and days and weeks and months and years, you develop the skill of focusing your attention, of bringing your attention back. Now that skill develops and changes over time, and you get better at bringing your attention back. But the most important thing that happens over time is that you develop a changed relationship to your focus of attention and your own thought processes. You come to the realization that you, as a self, as a being, as an entity, are not your thought processes, because you are exerting control over those thought processes. And if you are exerting control over those thought processes, that means that you are not your thought processes. You are something above those thought processes. And in psychology, we call this metacognition. The whole idea of self-regulation of your own thought processes. And as a meditator, as a yoga practitioner, you become better and better at focusing your attention and this change in relationship to your thought processes. And along with that comes the realization is that these are just thoughts. And therefore, you change your relationship to those thoughts. You are no longer driven by those thoughts. Your relationship to those thoughts changes. You react to those thoughts differently. You react less stressfully and less emotionally to those same thoughts. You come to this realization that they are just thoughts. And therefore, you have this new relationship of metacognition. And this is actually what Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are all about. They're all about achieving this state of regulation of attention and a change in relationship to your thought processes. That reduces your stress and emotional reactivity, but also enhances your ability to control the attention networks. You become so good at controlling your attention networks, you become more sensitive. You become more aware. You become more aware of your senses. You become more aware of your thought processes. And so as a consequence, that's increasing your stress management and at the same time increasing your mind-body awareness. So this is how we understand this. And scientists are starting to understand actually the neurophysiology of how this works. So we know that the attention networks are in the prefrontal cortex and the executive regions in the frontal lobe of the brain. This makes sense. And we are now starting to understand that those regions of the brain have inhibitory connections with the emotional brain, with the stress producing part of the brain called the limbic system. In fact, in long-term meditators, we actually see that the limbic system becomes smaller because you're using it less. You're less reactive. You're less stress and emotionally reactive. So this is how this whole process works of achieving these two major benefits of stress regulation and mind-body awareness. Now, of course, added to that, on the stress part, is the fact that you're doing these physical postures and exercises and the pranayama. And both of those also, through the mind-body connection, are affecting the stress and emotion response systems. So we know, for example, from a good deal of growing research, that simple, slow yogic breathing can reduce pain perception. It can also reduce stress perception. So it has immediate impacts on both stress and emotion regulation. So when you do this whole package together, you are getting these benefits. And that is how we come to this reduction in stress and emotional reactivity, and this increase in mind-body awareness or mindfulness.
Wow, that's fantastic. And this can relate to physical benefits too, for athletes or for physical harmony?
Yes, of course. The physical postures and exercises are very different than aerobic type exercises. There's a lot more stretching. There's a lot more isometric exercises. There's more focus on balance, etc. And they have a different effect on the body. And they have an effect on the body that typical aerobic exercises do not have. The pranayama, as I said, is extremely powerful, especially the long, slow, deep breathing, which has been the most studied. This improves your respiratory functioning. It changes the activity of both the stress and emotion response systems. There's evidence that shows that slow breathing can even help in the moderation of pain perception. So on the physical level, you're improving physical functioning, both respiratory and muscular, neuromuscular and musculoskeletal functioning. You're improving respiratory function. And then on the psychological level, you're improving mindfulness and reducing stress and emotional reactivity. Now, all of these things reflect in the body. If you are psychologically stressed, you will express tension in your body. And that, if continued, can lead to musculoskeletal conditions. One of the most common conditions is low back pain. There's also a high prevalence of neck pain because people hold this mental, emotional tension in their bodies. So with yoga, you physically release this with the asanas, the breathing, and you release the psychological component with the meditative component of yoga practice. So that's how we express this positive benefit in the physical body. Now you're also asking the question about performance, specifically with things like sports. Well, of course, holding physical tension in your body is not helpful if you're trying to manipulate your body to perform perfectly for some kind of sport, whether that's basketball or cricket or whatever sport you are trying to engage in. You need full control of your body. You need muscles that are not engaged in that activity to be relaxed because you don't need them. In fact, those muscles, if they're tensed, can actually interfere with your physical performance. So that is how you're optimizing the physical performance. Respiratory function is a key, especially in sports where there's a lot of aerobic activity required. So certainly basketball is that case. If you are learning to breathe properly, your breathing will be more efficient. And that means you will be less taxed in terms of performing that sport and engaging in that aerobic activity. Then comes the emotional and stress component. In competitive sports, this is big because you are competing. And competition, by definition, involves stress and emotion. And it is well known in sports performance that if your stress and emotional reactivity are excessive, that will negatively impact your sports performance. So the ability to manage stress and emotion more effectively means that you will be more under control and not have the negative impact of excessive stress and emotional reactivity. And then finally, the increase in mind-body awareness is absolutely essential because sports performance, especially for elite athletes, the success is measured not in centimeters, but in fractions of a millimeter. I mean, when you shoot a basketball from 10 meters and try and hit this little circle, this requires extreme sensory motor coordination. And the more sensitive you are to your own body, to its own performance, to its movement, to its balance, the more successful you're going to be in these very fine movements. So this mind-body awareness is a key, to be aware of your body in space, to be aware of your muscular tension, to be aware of how the muscles move, to how your body moves, in order for this precision to be in place. But even in non-aerobic sports like golf, I mean, you are holding your body posture, you're holding the club, you need to move and swing your arms in a certain way. This involves incredible precision. And the more sensitive you are to your body, the more mind-body awareness you have, the more mindfulness you have, the better you're going to physically perform, as well as the other aspects. And then there are secondary factors that are involved. So one of the big issues in modern sports, especially professional sports, is injury. One of the big things about injury is not having a flexible body. The more flexible your body is, the more you are aware of your body in space, the less you are prone to injuries. That's a major factor, especially in professional sports. The other thing about stress and emotion is that if you're experiencing stress and emotion, that's interfering with your ability to focus attention on the task at hand. So you're removing that disturbance mentally and emotionally. You're improving your flexibility and your resistance to injury, as well as enhancing all of the other aspects that are necessary for good sports performance.
Wow, that's fantastic. What is the role of yoga in mental health, especially in today's environment?
So the mental health component really is all about thought processes. You know, one of the misconceptions about mental health conditions is that these are sort of strange things that come on to us. We view them as sort of like a communicable disease. Oh, you've caught depression, or you've caught anxiety, you're trapped in anxiety. It's true that these particular mental health conditions are an aberrant behavior in the central nervous system. But what many people do not understand is that the major common issue for virtually all mental health conditions, for most mental health conditions, is aberrant thought processes. And that these thought processes are not just a symptom of the disease, they are essentially, in many mental health conditions, the actual cause, the underlying issue behind the disease itself. So, for example, in anxiety disorder, what the patient experiences is thoughts of anxiety or depression. In major depression, this is I'm alone, I have no future, I'm hopeless, I'm helpless. These are thoughts that are occurring. Now, as it turns out, if you are able to change those thought processes, you will actually change the disease. Because the thought processes are not just a symptom of the disease, they are an underlying part of the mechanism of the disease itself. You have a negative thought process that manifests in an emotional response and a physical response. That emotional and physical response generates another one, another negative depressive thought, and you're caught in this cycle of thought processes that are manifesting depression. So one of the most powerful forms and the most commonly used form of psychotherapy today is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the major underlying construct behind cognitive behavioral therapy is metacognition, the same construct that we achieve over long-term meditation practice. So when you start to master your own thought processes, you then become free from these depressive thoughts. In cognitive behavioral therapy, you learn to recognize these negative dysfunctional thoughts, these depressive thoughts. And then you replace those dysfunctional thoughts with neutral thoughts. And this is a very powerful and effective technique for most mental health conditions. So meditation shares with cognitive behavioral therapy the same outcome of metacognition. So this is how in a major way, yoga is contributing to these mental health conditions by changing the relationship to thought processes and by reducing the dysfunctional thoughts, which then reduce